In the middle of the 11th century, England stood as one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in Europe. Its laws, language, and leaders had developed over centuries of Saxon rule. Its administration was efficient, and its coasts guarded by a proud warrior class. Yet, within a single year, the entire ruling elite would be swept away, replaced by a new dynasty, a new aristocracy, and a new order that would reshape the kingdom for generations. The Norman conquest of England is often remembered for one battle, Hastings, but its story begins long before the armies gathered on that field. It stretches back to Viking raids, cross-channel politics, and rival claims to the throne. It draws in figures from Normandy, Norway, and beyond, and ends not with a single victory, but with a complete transformation of England's land, law, and society. This is the complete history of that transformation, from the Viking duchy that became Normandy, to the last days of the Anglo-Saxon kings, to the battles, revolts, and reforms that followed. Over the course of this journey, we will see how a single contested succession in the year 1066 set in motion changes whose effects can still be traced in England today. At the start of the 10th century, the coasts of northern France were no strangers to sudden violence. For decades, ships had appeared on the horizon, long, narrow, and swift. These were the longships of the Norse raiders, who came to plunder towns, monasteries, and markets along the rivers. In the years around 911, the Frankish kingdom, ruled by the Carolingian and later Capetian kings, faced an ongoing problem. The Vikings could not be fully driven out, and the cost of defending every river and coast was draining the realm. One Frankish ruler, Charles the Simple, made a calculated choice. Rather than continue endless campaigns, he decided to make peace with one of the most prominent Viking leaders, a man named Rollo. The arrangement was formalized in a treaty traditionally called the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte around the year 911. In it, Charles granted Rollo and his followers land along the lower Seine River, including the important town of Rouen. In return, Rollo promised to defend that land against other Viking raiders and to accept baptism into the Christian faith. The settlement created what became known as the Duchy of Normandy. At first, it was a pragmatic deal. The Franks secured a powerful military buffer against further attacks, and the Vikings gained a legitimate base from which they could farm, trade, and rule without constant pursuit. Yet over time, something deeper happened. These Norse settlers began to change. They married local women, adopted the old French language, and learned Frankish customs of law, landholding, and government. The transformation was not instant. For a generation, the rulers of Normandy and their followers still valued the seafaring, warrior ethos of their Scandinavian ancestors, but they also adapted to the realities of their new home. In place of scattered raiding parties, they built a system of lordship and vassalage, borrowing from Frankish feudal models. The land was divided among loyal followers who provided military service in return. This blend of Scandinavian vigor and Frankish organization produced a society well suited to both warfare and governance. Rollo's successors, such as his son William Longsword, continued this integration. They cultivated alliances with neighboring powers, both through marriage and diplomacy, and expanded their control over surrounding territories. Under Duke Richard I and later Duke Richard II, Normandy grew stronger. It became a stable and wealthy duchy, not just a haven for former raiders, but a political force in northern France. One of the most striking aspects of this evolution was the Norman embrace of mounted warfare. The Normans developed into one of the most formidable cavalry forces in Europe. Knights, bound by oaths of loyalty to their duke, trained for shock combat with lance and sword. This style of fighting, combined with their network of fortified places, made Normandy difficult to attack and formidable when projecting power outward. The Norman dukes also worked to strengthen their religious legitimacy. The initial baptism of Rollo had been symbolic, but his successors actively patronized monasteries and churches. They founded new abbeys, reformed existing ones, and invited prominent churchmen into Normandy. This not only bolstered their standing with the papacy and other Christian rulers, but also helped bring literacy, law, and record-keeping into their administration. Normandy's position on the Channel coast shaped its destiny. Its rivers connected it to the trade routes of the interior, while its ports gave easy access to England, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Merchants and craftsmen flourished in towns like Rouen, Caen, and Bayeux. The duchy became a place where soldiers, sailors, and traders could all find opportunity, and this mix of talents reinforced its ability to act on a wider stage. By the turn of the 11th century, Normandy was no longer a frontier settlement of foreign warriors. It was a consolidated duchy under a single ruler, with a defined territory, a strong military tradition, and a culture that blended Norse, Frankish, and Christian elements. Under Duke Richard II, who ruled from the late 10th century into the early 11th, Normandy enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. The ducal court attracted knights from other regions, clerics from renowned abbeys, and envoys from neighboring realms. Normandy's rulers also kept a careful balance in their relations with the kings of France. Technically, the Duke of Normandy was a vassal of the French crown, owing loyalty to the king. In practice, the duchy was nearly autonomous, and its dukes acted with considerable independence. This independence allowed them to pursue their own alliances and policies, sometimes in cooperation with the king, sometimes in quiet rivalry. During this period, Norman influence began to reach across the Channel. There were already long-standing ties between Normandy and England, forged through trade, occasional Viking alliances, and shared interests in resisting rival powers. Norman adventurers served as mercenaries abroad, and Norman merchants visited English ports. These connections would prove significant in later decades, as political events on both sides of the Channel began to intersect more directly. When Duke Richard II died in the early 11th century, he was succeeded by his son, Richard III, and shortly after, by his younger son, Robert the Magnificent. Robert's rule, though short, was notable for his pilgrimage to Jerusalem and for fathering a son out of wedlock who would become William, later known as William the Conqueror. Robert's death in the year 1035 left this young boy as Duke of Normandy, beginning a turbulent period in which the stability and strength built over more than a century would be tested. From the treaty with Rollo to the accession of young William, Normandy's story is one of transformation, of how a Viking foothold became a disciplined, wealthy, and ambitious duchy. The Norman dukes combined the adaptability of their Norse ancestors with the institutions and culture of the Franks, creating a society unlike any other in Europe. Their military skill, political ambition, and connections across the Channel were already in place, setting the stage for their eventual role in one of the most famous conquests in medieval history. By the middle of the 10th century, England was a united kingdom in name, but still shaped by the legacies of earlier centuries of division and Viking pressure. The work of uniting the realm had been largely accomplished by the kings of the House of Wessex, who brought under one crown the territories that had once been separate kingdoms. Yet the memory of conflict, both with Scandinavian invaders and among English rulers themselves, was still fresh. Under King Edgar, often called Edgar the Peaceful, England experienced a rare period of stability. His reign, beginning in the year 959, saw the consolidation of royal authority across the shires. The administrative system that developed in these years would endure for centuries. Shires were divided into hundreds, each with its own courts, where local disputes were settled, taxes assessed, and justice carried out. The king's representatives, known as reeves, ensured royal law was upheld. This was not an abstract system of governance. It affected the lives of farmers, merchants, and warriors in every part of the realm. The strength of this administration was supported by England's wealth. Fertile farmland, productive fisheries, and busy market towns generated resources that could be taxed and mobilized. A key part of this system was the geld, a land tax collected at regular intervals. Unlike some parts of Europe where central authority was weak, the English crown had the means to raise revenue directly and reliably. This gave the king the ability to fund defenses, build religious houses, and maintain his court. England's defense rested on a mix of permanent and temporary forces. The king could call on the fyrd, a levy of free men who served for limited periods, usually drawn from the shires when danger threatened. Alongside these were the housecarls, professional warriors who formed the backbone of the king's personal guard. This combination allowed the crown to respond to raids quickly while maintaining a core of trained fighters for more sustained campaigns. Despite Edgar's reputation for peace, his reign and those that followed were not without challenge. Viking raids had diminished in frequency, but not entirely vanished. The possibility of a large-scale Scandinavian return remained a concern, and coastal defenses were maintained with care. The stability of Edgar's time gave way to renewed turbulence under Ethelred, later known as Ethelred the Unready. He came to the throne as a child in the year 978, following the suspicious death of his half-brother, Edward the Martyr. Ethelred's reign was marked by the return of large-scale Viking invasions, particularly from the Danish realm. The term unready is a later nickname derived from Old English meaning poorly advised, and it reflects the chronicler's view of his inability to deal effectively with the crises he faced. The Danish fleets of this era were not small raiding parties, but organized forces capable of prolonged campaigns. To meet them, Ethelred revived and expanded the practice of paying tribute, known as danegeld, in hopes of buying peace. While this sometimes brought temporary relief, it also encouraged further demands. The cycle of payment and renewed attack wore on the kingdom's resources and morale. The situation reached a turning point in the early 11th century with the arrival of King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark. In the year 1013, Svein launched a full-scale invasion and forced Ethelred to flee to Normandy, where his queen, Emma, had family ties. Svein briefly claimed the English crown but died the following year. His son, Knut, inherited his ambition and, after a renewed campaign, became King of England in 1016. Knut's rule marked a remarkable shift. A Danish king ruling over England might have been expected to favor his Scandinavian followers, but Knut governed with an eye toward stability and integration. He retained much of the Anglo-Saxon administrative system, upheld the laws of earlier kings, and worked closely with the English Church. Knut also ruled Denmark and later Norway, making him the head of a North Sea empire that linked multiple kingdoms through trade, politics, and war. During Knut's reign, England continued to prosper. The king patronized the church, commissioning new building projects and supporting monastic reform. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, cementing an alliance between his dynasty and Norman interests across the Channel. His court was a cosmopolitan place where English, Danish, and Norman influences mixed. Cnut's death in 1035 brought his two sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, into conflict over succession. Harold ruled first, but his time on the throne was short and contested. When Harthacnut became king, he faced resentment for heavy taxation and died suddenly in 1042. With no direct heir from Knut's line, the crown returned to the House of Wessex in the person of Edward, later called the Confessor. This return to a native dynasty was welcomed by many English nobles, but it also came with new political realities. Edward had spent much of his youth in Normandy and was more familiar with its court and customs than with some of his own nobility. His reign would be marked by both the strength of England's inherited institutions and the growing influence of Norman connections, a combination that would play a decisive role in the events to come. By the time Edward took the throne, England had behind it a century of administrative refinement, economic growth, and military adaptation. The kingdom was richer and more organized than many of its continental neighbors, with a functioning tax system, local courts, and a tradition of kingship that blended military leadership with law-giving. Yet it was also vulnerable. The wealth that made it strong made it tempting to outsiders, and the question of succession, never fully secure in a hereditary monarchy, would soon open the door to foreign ambitions. When Edward, later known as the Confessor, was crowned King of England in the year 1042, it marked the return of the House of Wessex to the English throne after the Danish interlude under King Cnut and his sons. For many in the realm, this was a restoration of native rule, a sign that the kingdom was returning to its pre-conquest traditions. Yet Edward was far from a conventional Anglo-Saxon monarch. Edward had spent much of his early life in exile. After his father, King Ethelred, was driven from England during the campaigns of King Sweyn Forkbeard, Edward and his mother, Emma of Normandy, had sought refuge across the Channel. His formative years were spent in the ducal court of Normandy, among a people whose culture, language, and customs differed from those of the Anglo-Saxon elite. He became fluent in the Norman French tongue, learned the formal etiquette of the continental aristocracy, and grew close to Norman churchmen who valued discipline, reform, and close ties to Rome. When Edward returned to England to claim his throne, he brought with him not only the habits of a foreign court, but also a network of personal relationships forged during those years abroad. Many of his trusted companions were Normans, men who had served in ducal households or in the Norman church. This fact alone was enough to cause unease among some of England's most powerful native families, particularly those who had fought to maintain their influence during the turbulent reigns of Cnut's sons. Edward's first years as king saw him working to establish his authority over a realm where the great earls held considerable power. The kingdom was divided into large earldoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, each controlled by a noble with its own military following and local authority. The most influential of these magnates was Earl Godwin of Wessex. Godwin had risen to prominence under King Cnut and maintained his position during the transition to Edward's rule. Through marriage and alliances, he had made his family the most powerful in England, with his sons and daughters positioned to inherit influence across the kingdom. Tensions between Edward and Godwin emerged early. Edward's preference for Norman advisors was evident in the appointments he made to key positions, especially within the church. He elevated Norman clerics to bishoprics and abbeys, granting them authority and lands that some English nobles believed should have gone to their own kin. One notable example was Robert of Jumièges, a Norman monk whom Edward appointed as Bishop of London and later as Archbishop of Canterbury. Robert's appointment was controversial. He was respected by reformers, but mistrusted by many in the English aristocracy, who saw his rise as a symbol of foreign intrusion into English affairs. The relationship between Edward and the Godwin family was further strained by events in the year 1051. That year, a quarrel broke out in Dover between local townspeople and the visiting retinue of Eustace, Count of Boulogne, who was married to Edward's sister. Accounts describe the incident as a violent clash, leaving several dead on both sides. When the king demanded that Earl Godwin punish the townspeople for their role in the fight, Godwin refused, arguing that the citizens were defending themselves against aggression. This defiance set the stage for a direct confrontation. Edward summoned an army to confront Godwin, but the Earl could not secure enough support from his fellow magnates to challenge the king directly. The result was Godwin's exile, along with several members of his family, including his sons. In their absence, Edward tightened his control, surrounding himself with Norman allies and redistributing some of the Godwin lands. For a time, It seemed the king had successfully reduced the influence of his most powerful rival. Yet Edward's reliance on Norman friends and advisors came with risks. Many of these men were ambitious, and some had their own agendas that were not always aligned with the interests of the English crown. Moreover, Edward's childlessness meant that the question of succession was already simmering in the background. Without an heir, the future of the throne was uncertain, and every political decision carried the potential to tip the balance toward one faction or another. During these years, Edward also invested heavily in religious projects, which would become one of the hallmarks of his reign. His piety was widely acknowledged, and he supported the building and endowment of churches and monasteries. His most ambitious project was the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in a grand Romanesque style, influenced by continental architecture. This work not only reflected his personal devotion, but also symbolized the blending of English and Norman traditions in his reign. The court itself reflected this cultural blend. While Old English remained the language of much of the administration and law, Norman French was increasingly heard in the king's inner circle. Diplomacy with Normandy grew closer, with regular exchanges of envoys and gifts between Edward and Duke William of Normandy, who was still a young but ambitious ruler consolidating his own power. It is in this period that later Norman chroniclers would claim Edward promised the English throne to William, a claim that would become central to William's justification for invasion after Edward's death. Whether such a promise was made is debated by historians, but what is certain is that the king's Norman ties were strong and visible. By the late 1040s, the balance of power began to shift again. Earl Godwin and his sons returned from exile in 1052 with significant support from the English nobility and populace. The king, unwilling to risk civil war, restored their lands and titles. This restored the Godwin family's dominance, but it also created a fragile political arrangement in which the king's Norman allies and his most powerful English subjects existed in uneasy coexistence. Edward's reign during this period was a constant negotiation between these two influences: his loyalty to the friends and traditions of his youth in Normandy, and the practical necessity of governing through the established Anglo-Saxon elite. His personal qualities, reserved, devout, and often distant from day-to-day politics, meant that much of the realm's governance was in the hands of its great earls. This arrangement worked as long as the interests of crown and nobility aligned, but it carried the seeds of future conflict. By the early 1050s, the central question of the succession was becoming harder to ignore. Edward remained without an heir, and while he had brothers-in-law, nephews, and other relatives with potential claims, none had been publicly named as his successor. In the background, the king's Norman connections, his reliance on foreign advisors, and his strained relationship with the most powerful English family were creating a political environment in which multiple factions were quietly preparing for the eventual contest over the throne. As Edward's Norman friendships deepened and his ties to Duke William remained steady, the stage was set for a coming collision between continental ambition and English tradition. The next years would see the rise of one figure who would play a decisive role in that struggle: Earl Godwin's son Harold, whose own ascent would change the course of the kingdom's history. When the Godwin family returned from exile in the autumn of the year 1052, they did not come back as a broken or humbled house. Instead, they returned in force, reclaiming their earldoms and reasserting themselves as the most powerful noble family in England. Their leader, Earl Godwin of Wessex, had maneuvered with skill, gathering support from other magnates and from townsfolk who feared the growing influence of the king's Norman circle. King Edward, faced with the possibility of armed conflict, had little choice but to negotiate. The terms of the Godwins' restoration were generous. Lands confiscated during their absence were returned, and their earldoms reinstated. The political cost for Edward was considerable. His Norman allies, who had benefited from the Godwins' exile, saw their influence diminish almost overnight. Yet for the time being, the king and the family from Wessex maintained an uneasy truce. Within the Godwin family One figure now began to emerge as the central player: Harold, the second son of Earl Godwin. Harold had accompanied his father into exile and had shared in the family's triumphant return. But his rise to prominence came not just from family loyalty. It came from a combination of personal ability, military competence, and political shrewdness. In the year 1053, a sudden shift altered the family's internal hierarchy. Earl Godwin died unexpectedly, reportedly collapsing during a feast at the king's court. His death might have weakened the family's position, but instead, it became the moment when Harold stepped fully into the role of leader. He succeeded his father as Earl of Wessex, the wealthiest and most strategically important earldom in the realm. This position placed him in direct control of much of southern England, including the key ports and the approaches to London. Harold's new status also made him a central figure in the king's government. Edward, though still wary of the Godwin influence, could not ignore the Earl's ability to raise armies quickly and manage complex local politics. Harold distinguished himself in campaigns against the Welsh, where he demonstrated both military skill and diplomatic tact. These successes strengthened his standing not just in the south, but across the kingdom, as other earls came to respect his capabilities. While Harold's power was growing, the Godwinsons, as a whole, were expanding their reach. Harold's brothers and sisters held or would gain important positions. Tostig became Earl of Northumbria, Gurth took over East Anglia, and Leofwine held territory in the southeast. The family network extended across much of England's political map, making them rivals to the crown in terms of influence and resources. This consolidation of power was not without tension. Harold and Tostig in particular, though brothers, would later find themselves in sharp conflict over methods of rule and political alliances. For the moment, however, the family presented a united front. Their shared control over multiple earldoms gave them a decisive advantage in the Witan, the royal council that advised the king and played a role in succession decisions. King Edward, still without an heir, had to reckon with the fact that the Godwinsons could shape the future of the crown. While Norman allies and connections remained important to him, the king increasingly relied on Harold to manage both domestic affairs and military defense. This reliance gave Harold an opportunity to act as something close to a deputy ruler, especially in situations where Edward's interests and the realm's immediate needs intersected. One such opportunity came in the mid-50s when trouble flared on England's western frontier. Welsh rulers, taking advantage of divisions in the English court, had raided into border territories. Harold was tasked with leading a campaign to reassert control, and he responded decisively. His forces moved swiftly, driving deep into Welsh lands, and secured terms favorable to the English crown. This not only enhanced Harold's military reputation, but also positioned him as the kingdom's chief problem solver, an image that would serve him well in later political struggles. The growing stature of Harold was reflected in how foreign powers viewed him. Envoys and merchants arriving in England often found that matters could be settled more efficiently through the Earl of Wessex than through the royal household itself. While this did not diminish Edward's formal authority, it blurred the distinction between royal power and the influence of a leading noble family. At court, Harold maintained a careful balance. He did not openly challenge Edward's Norman friends, but he ensured that key positions, particularly in the regions under his family's control, were held by loyal Englishmen. This gradual reassertion of native influence was subtle, but it shifted the tone of governance in ways that the Norman advisors could not fail to notice. Meanwhile, the political culture of England was changing. The combination of a childless king, a powerful noble family, and foreign interests created an environment in which succession planning became a matter of constant speculation. The Godwinsons, with Harold at their head, were now considered by many to be the most likely power brokers in any future transfer of the crown. Harold's rise during these years was marked by a blend of personal ambition and practical governance. He was careful to appear as the king's loyal servant, but his actions, strengthening his family's hold over vast territories, winning military victories, and cultivating respect among the nobility, laid the foundation for a claim to kingship that would later be tested on the battlefield. By the middle of the decade, Harold Godwinson was not only the most powerful earl in England, but also the figure most capable of uniting the realm's military and political resources. His growing influence set the stage for events that would draw him into direct engagement with Duke William of Normandy, a man who believed he had his own claim to the English crown. The events surrounding Harold Godwinson's journey to Normandy remain among the most debated episodes in the lead-up to the Norman conquest. The basic facts, as they appear in the sources, are simple enough. Harold, Earl of Wessex, traveled across the Channel and spent time at the court of Duke William of Normandy. But the reasons for his journey and the nature of what occurred there were interpreted very differently by Norman and English chroniclers. These conflicting accounts would later become a cornerstone of the case for war. By the early 1960s of the 11th century, Harold was the most powerful man in England after King Edward. His authority as Earl of Wessex was unrivaled, and his influence in the royal council made him a central figure in the kingdom's political life. The question of who would succeed Edward was becoming urgent. Edward was aging, had no children, and his health was not what it had been. Factions within and beyond England speculated about the future of the crown. Among those with an interest was Duke William of Normandy, who had, according to Norman sources, received some form of promise from Edward years earlier. The exact purpose of Harold's trip is obscured by the contradictions in the evidence. The Norman account, most famously depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry and in the writings of chroniclers such as William of Poitiers, claimed that Harold was sent by King Edward himself. According to this version, Edward dispatched Harold to confirm his earlier promise that William would inherit the English throne. In Norman retellings, Harold was a trusted envoy, meant to formally pledge his support for William's succession. The English sources tell a different story. Some suggest Harold's voyage was prompted by personal matters, possibly the release of hostages. Years earlier, during the political conflicts of the Godwin family's exile and return, Harold's brother Wulfnoth and his nephew Hakon had ended up in Normandy as hostages to secure political agreements. According to this version, Harold's aim was to negotiate their return, not to involve himself in any promise of succession. Regardless of his motives, Harold's journey began along the southern coast of England, probably from one of the ports under his control. The Channel crossing in the 11th century was unpredictable and often dangerous. Storms could drive ships far off course, and pirates or hostile forces were an ever-present risk. According to Norman sources, Harold's voyage met with misfortune. He was driven ashore, not in Normandy, but in the territory of Ponthieu, a small but strategically placed county north of Normandy. There, he fell into the hands of Count Guy of Ponthieu, who took him as a valuable prisoner. It was Duke William who secured Harold's release, either through payment or political influence, and brought him to Normandy. This act of intervention, if true, immediately placed Harold under an obligation to the Duke. From the Norman perspective, this was the first step in a carefully staged process of winning Harold's loyalty. During Harold's stay in Normandy, William hosted him with all the honors due to a high-ranking guest. They traveled together, engaged in hunting and feasting, and, according to Norman accounts, even fought side by side in a campaign against rebellious Bretons. The purpose of such shared endeavors was not simply entertainment. It was a way to build bonds of loyalty and mutual respect in the warrior culture of the time. It was at some point during this visit that the alleged oath was sworn. The Norman narrative is explicit. Harold, in the presence of William and leading Norman lords, placed his hands on holy relics and swore to uphold William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. This was no casual promise. In medieval society, an oath sworn on sacred relics carried immense spiritual and legal weight. Breaking such an oath was considered both a mortal sin and a breach of honor. English accounts either omit the oath entirely or portray it as extracted under pressure. Some later English chroniclers claimed Harold was tricked, invited to place his hands on a chest without being told it contained relics, or cornered into agreeing to terms he had no intention of honoring. These versions frame the event as part of a calculated Norman attempt to create a pretext for future demands. Whatever the truth, William believed, or chose to believe, that Harold had bound himself to support his succession. For the Duke, this was a significant diplomatic victory. Harold was the most powerful man in England, and his public endorsement would have strengthened William's position both in England and abroad. Eventually, Harold returned to England, with or without the hostages he had hoped to retrieve. The visit left its mark on Anglo-Norman relations. In William's mind, Harold was now his sworn ally in the matter of the English crown. In Harold's mind, the trip may have been a delicate balancing act, maintaining cordial relations with the Duke without committing himself in a way that would undermine his own standing in England. The episode would not fade quietly into the background. When Edward the Confessor died in early 1066, William would point to Harold's oath as proof that the English earl was a perjurer and a usurper. The moral force of that accusation, backed by the authority of the Church, would become a central part of the Norman justification for invasion. For now, in the mid-1060s, Harold returned to his position in England with his authority intact and perhaps even enhanced by his status as a man who had dealt directly with the powerful Duke of Normandy. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict had been sown. In the autumn of the year 1065, a political crisis erupted in the north of England that would permanently alter the balance of power among the kingdom's leading nobles, and, more importantly, fracture the unity of the most powerful family in the realm, the Godwinsons. This was the revolt of the Northumbrians against their earl, Tostig Godwinson, and it would have lasting consequences for Harold Godwinson's path to the throne and for the stability of England itself. Tostig, the third son of the late Earl Godwin, had been appointed Earl of Northumbria in the early 1060s. Northumbria was a vast and often unruly earldom stretching from the Humber River to the Scottish border. It was culturally distinct from much of the rest of England, with a strong tradition of local autonomy and lingering Scandinavian influences from earlier centuries of Norse settlement. Governing it required a careful blend of firmness and diplomacy, as its magnates were quick to resent any hint of overreach from the south. Tostig was, by most accounts, a capable and ambitious noble, but his rule in Northumbria quickly became controversial. Chroniclers hostile to him accused him of heavy taxation, arbitrary justice, and even political assassinations of prominent Northumbrian leaders. Some of these accusations may have been exaggerated by his enemies, but it is clear that by the middle of the decade, resentment toward his governance had grown deep among the Northumbrian elite. The tipping point came in October of 1065, when a group of leading Northumbrians, including both nobles and thanes, rose in open rebellion. They gathered at York, the political and ecclesiastical center of the earldom, and declared their refusal to accept Tostig's authority any longer. They accused him of unjust governance, extortion, and favoring his southern retainers over local lords. The rebels then took a decisive step. They appointed Morcar, the younger brother of Edwin, Earl of Mercia, as their new earl. This was more than a local protest. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority to appoint earls and to the political dominance of the Godwin family. The Northumbrian rebels did not simply hold their ground in York. They marched south, gathering more support as they went, and eventually reached Northampton, where Harold Godwinson came to meet them on behalf of King Edward. Harold's role in the negotiations was crucial. He was both the king's chief advisor and Tostig's elder brother, and his position placed him between loyalty to his family and the need to preserve peace in the kingdom. The talks that followed, were tense. The rebels stood firm in their demands. They would not accept Tostig's return under any circumstances, and they insisted that Morcar remain in place as their earl. Harold, assessing the situation, saw that a military campaign to restore his brother would risk civil war, especially since many of the Midland and Northern magnates supported the rebels. Winter was approaching, and the kingdom's stability was already fragile given Edward's age and lack of an heir. In the end, Harold made the politically pragmatic but personally painful choice. He agreed to the rebels' demands, formally confirming Morcar as Earl of Northumbria. Tostig, furious at what he saw as a betrayal, was declared an outlaw and forced into exile. He fled across the Channel to Flanders, where his wife Judith, daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, could offer him refuge. From there, Tostig began plotting his return, not as a reconciled subject of the king, but as an enemy determined to recover his lost position through force. The consequences of Harold's decision were immediate. On the one hand, his handling of the crisis enhanced his reputation among many English magnates as a statesman willing to place the kingdom's peace above personal interest. It demonstrated a willingness to compromise and avoid unnecessary bloodshed, qualities valued in a potential king. On the other hand, it drove a wedge into the Godwin family that could not be healed. Tostig never forgave Harold, and their enmity would play directly into the hands of foreign powers in the months to come. Tostig's exile also reshaped the political landscape in the north. With Morcar in Northumbria and his brother Edwin in Mercia, the two most powerful northern and midland earldoms were now under the control of a single family, the House of Leofric. This family's rivalry with the Godwinsons had deep roots, and while Harold maintained a working alliance with Edwin and Morcar for the moment, the balance of power was shifting. The unity of the English aristocracy, already fragile, was now weakened further by these competing blocks of influence. In exile, Tostig sought allies. His marriage into the Flemish ruling house gave him access to continental contacts, and his own record as a capable, if unpopular military leader made him a potential asset to those seeking a foothold in England. Before long, Tostig's search for support would lead him to a figure with ambitions of his own, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway. The alliance between the exiled English earl and the veteran Norwegian warrior king would become one of the most dangerous threats Harold Godwinson would face in the year to come. Meanwhile, King Edward, now in failing health, withdrew further from active governance. Increasingly, it was Harold who managed the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom. His position as the foremost earl, his role in the Witan, and his control over the southern coast made him the natural leader in times of crisis. Yet the events of 1065 had shown that even his influence had limits. The rebellion had succeeded without a fight, and the precedent had been set that a determined coalition of local leaders could defy the king's choice of earl. The fracture between Harold and Tostig had implications beyond the personal. It meant that when the succession crisis came to its peak after Edward's death, Harold would face not only external claimants, but also a hostile brother prepared to join forces with those claimants. Tostig's intimate knowledge of England's defenses, noble politics, and coastal vulnerabilities would make him an especially dangerous opponent. Thus, by the end of 1065, the kingdom stood in a precarious position. The north was under new leadership. The most powerful noble family was divided, and the king was visibly approaching the end of his life without naming a clear successor. The stage was set for a year in which multiple claimants would converge on England, each backed by armies and alliances, and each believing they had a rightful claim to the throne. In the early days of January, in the year 1066, the long reign of King Edward the Confessor came to its end. For more than 2 decades, Edward had presided over England, a realm rich, orderly, and admired in Europe for its governance and prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, his rule had left unresolved the single most critical question in medieval monarchy. Who would succeed him? Edward had no children. Throughout his reign, this absence of an heir had been the quiet undercurrent shaping alliances, rivalries, and foreign interest in the English throne. When he finally succumbed to illness on the 5th day of January, the issue could no longer be deferred. The next ruler would not inherit the crown through simple hereditary right. Instead, the succession would be decided by a contest of claims, legitimacy, and force. The immediate events after Edward's death unfolded with striking speed. The Witan, England's royal council of leading nobles, bishops, and senior officials, met to determine the new king. This body, while not bound by rigid rules of inheritance, traditionally sought a candidate who combined royal blood, political support, and the ability to defend the realm. Their choice was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. Harold's election was not an impulsive act. For years, he had been the kingdom's foremost military leader and chief administrator. His decisive handling of crises, such as the Northumbrian Revolt, and his ability to rally both Southern and Midland support made him the strongest native candidate. His family's wealth and network of earldoms gave him the resources to act quickly against any threat. In the eyes of the Witan, Harold was the man most capable of preserving stability at a moment when instability could invite disaster. On the 6th day of January, the day after Edward's death, Harold was crowned king. The ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey, the newly completed church that Edward himself had commissioned. Contemporary sources differ on who placed the crown upon Harold's head. Some say it was Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, others Archbishop Ealdred of York. This detail would later become ammunition for Harold's enemies, as Stigand's position was disputed by Rome, and a coronation by him could be painted as illegitimate. While Harold's elevation was swift and supported by many of England's leading figures, it was not uncontested. Almost immediately, other claimants began to prepare their cases, both diplomatic and military, against him. 3 men in particular would challenge his rule, each with a distinct claim and base of support. The first was William, Duke of Normandy. William's assertion rested on 2 pillars: a supposed promise from Edward years earlier naming him heir, and the oath that Harold himself had allegedly sworn during his visit to Normandy. From William's perspective, Harold's acceptance of the crown was a direct betrayal of sworn loyalty, making him both an oath-breaker and a usurper. The Duke's ambitions were not merely personal. The conquest of England would vastly increase his power and prestige, uniting 2 rich territories under his rule. The second was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. Hardrada's claim was rooted in an earlier agreement between his predecessor, King Magnus of Norway, and King Harthacnut of England and Denmark. According to this pact, if either king died without an heir, the other would inherit his realm. While this arrangement had never been acted upon, Harthacnut's death in 1042 had led to Edward's accession rather than Norwegian rule. Hardrada regarded it as valid. Known across Europe as a seasoned warrior and veteran of campaigns from Scandinavia to Byzantium, Hardrada saw in Edward's death an opportunity to press his rights by force. The third potential claimant was Edgar Etheling, the grandson of King Edmund Ironside, and the last surviving male member of the royal house of Wessex in direct line. Edgar's claim was by blood perhaps the strongest of all, but his youth, he was still in his early teens, and lack of military backing made him an unlikely choice for the Witan. Nevertheless, his existence as a legitimate heir would be a factor in the political maneuvering of the months to come. Harold was well aware that his coronation was the beginning, not the end, of the struggle for the throne. His first priority was to secure the kingdom's defenses. England's wealth, especially along the southern and eastern coasts, made it an inviting target. The new king organized his forces for a double task: guarding the Channel coast against a Norman landing and monitoring the northern approaches for any move by Hardrada or his allies. Complicating matters was the presence of his exiled brother Tostig on the continent. Tostig's hatred for Harold after the events of the previous year was deep, and his search for allies had already taken him to Flanders and beyond. Harold could not know exactly where Tostig would strike, but he understood that his brother's knowledge of English defenses could be used to devastating effect. Diplomatically, Harold moved to strengthen his position. He married Edith, the sister of Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. This alliance bound the two most powerful northern earldoms to his cause, at least temporarily, and was a clear effort to secure unity in the face of external threats. It also reinforced his claim that he ruled with the consent of England's leading families, not merely by the decision of the southern magnates. Despite these preparations, Harold faced an uncomfortable reality. England's military system, based on the furred levy, was not designed for long-term standing defense. Men called up for service were usually expected to serve for only a set period before returning to their farms and trades. Sustaining a large force along the coast for months on end would strain resources and risk weakening loyalty. Timing would be everything. In Normandy, William began laying the groundwork for his own challenge. He sent envoys to Rome, framing Harold's coronation as an act of perjury and rebellion against legitimate authority. The support of the Pope, if secured, would lend spiritual weight to his cause and encourage allies to join his enterprise. In Norway, Hardrada was already gathering ships and men, his seasoned warriors eager for the wealth and glory a campaign in England could bring. For Harold, the months after his coronation were a race against time. He needed to consolidate his rule, maintain readiness, and anticipate where and when the inevitable attacks would come. His position was strong, but not unassailable. England's unity rested heavily on his leadership, and any serious defeat could unravel the alliances he had so carefully constructed. By the close of January 1066, the kingdom stood on the threshold of war. A new king sat on the throne, but two formidable rulers abroad, each commanding fleets, armies, and legal arguments for the crown, were preparing to sail against him. And somewhere across the sea, Harold's own brother plotted his return, not in reconciliation, but in vengeance. When news reached Normandy that Harold Godwinson had been crowned King of England, Duke William did not treat it as a distant development in a neighboring realm. For him, it was a personal affront, a breach of sworn loyalty, and a direct challenge to a claim he had long considered secure. The oath Harold had allegedly sworn during his visit to Normandy, whether sincere or coerced, was now the cornerstone of William's argument that the English throne was rightfully his. William's first step was not to raise an army, but to construct a case strong enough to win allies. In the 11th century, kingship was not decided by force alone. Legitimacy was a powerful weapon in its own right. A ruler who could portray his cause as just in the eyes of both secular lords and the church could draw men, ships, and money from far beyond his own borders. The Duke's narrative, promoted by his clerics and envoys, framed Harold as an oath-breaker. According to the Norman version of events, Harold had sworn to support William's succession and had done so on sacred relics, making the oath binding before God. By accepting the crown for himself, Harold had not only betrayed William personally, but had also committed a grave sin. This was a message carefully crafted to resonate with an audience steeped in the religious and legal traditions of medieval Christendom. William dispatched envoys to the papal court in Rome, led by influential churchmen from Normandy. They presented the Duke's case to Pope Alexander II, emphasizing both the alleged oath and Harold's coronation under Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, whose position was unrecognized by Rome due to earlier irregularities in his appointment. This detail allowed William's supporters to argue that Harold's coronation was not merely politically dubious, but spiritually invalid. At a time when the papacy was engaged in broader reforms to strengthen its moral and political authority, the opportunity to weigh in on a dispute of such magnitude was significant. Supporting William would allow the Pope to assert Rome's role as the arbiter of legitimacy in Christian rulership. By the spring of 1066, William had secured a remarkable endorsement. Pope Alexander granted him a papal banner, a consecrated symbol that proclaimed the Norman campaign a holy cause. The significance of this approval cannot be overstated. The papal banner gave William's planned invasion the character of a sanctioned endeavor, akin in some minds to a crusade. It encouraged knights and lords from beyond Normandy's borders to take part without fear of spiritual condemnation for waging war against a Christian kingdom. This transformed the coming invasion from a purely dynastic conflict into a campaign with moral and religious overtones. With papal backing in hand, William turned to the practical matter of building an invasion force. Normandy was a powerful duchy, but conquering England required resources beyond its own capacity. The Duke called upon his vassals to provide their military service in ships, and he extended invitations to lords in neighboring regions, Brittany, Flanders, and parts of northern France, offering them the promise of English lands and wealth in return for their participation. This promise was more than empty incentive. William had every intention of redistributing English estates to reward those who fought for him, a practice common in the feudal world. Such an arrangement appealed strongly to ambitious knights and younger sons of noble families who had limited prospects at home. The chance to win land in a rich and well-governed kingdom was a rare opportunity, and men responded with enthusiasm. The logistical demands of the enterprise were immense. Ships had to be built or requisitioned in large numbers. Normandy's shipwrights worked at harbors along the Seine and the Channel coast, constructing and outfitting vessels capable of carrying men, horses, and supplies across the sea. Horses were particularly vital, for the Norman cavalry was the decisive arm of William's military strength. Transporting them required specialized craft and careful handling to ensure they arrived fit for battle. Weapons and armor had to be gathered and distributed. Smiths forged mail hauberks, helmets, and swords, while carpenters produced lances, shields, and siege equipment. Provisions for the voyage and the campaign, grain, wine, salted meat, and fodder for horses were stockpiled in coastal depots. Every detail had to be managed to ensure that once the invasion began, the army could sustain itself in hostile territory. While the military preparations advanced, William also engaged in diplomacy to neutralize potential threats. A two-front war could spell disaster, so the Duke sought assurances from his neighbors and rivals that they would not interfere while he was across the Channel. In particular, he maintained a careful relationship with the King of France, who was William's feudal overlord, but also a potential rival. By the summer of 1066, William had assembled a coalition army unmatched in Norman history. Chroniclers give varying estimates of its size, but all agree it was a multinational force with contingents from across Western Europe. Knights and men-at-arms from Normandy formed the core, joined by Bretons, known for their light cavalry and archers, Flemish infantry, and adventurers from as far as southern France and Italy. The papal banner, displayed alongside the ducal standard, served as a unifying symbol for this diverse host. Yet, despite all this preparation, one critical factor lay beyond William's control: the wind. The Channel could be a treacherous barrier, and a crossing of such scale required favorable conditions. Through late summer, the invasion force gathered on the Norman coast, ready but unable to sail. Prolonged delays carried their own risks. Supplies had to be consumed, discipline maintained, and morale kept steady. William knew that timing was crucial. A premature landing could mean disaster, while waiting too long could allow Harold to strike first, or for other events to alter the political landscape entirely. Unbeknown to William, events far to the north would soon disrupt Harold's plans and create the opening the Duke needed. But for now, as the summer of 1066 progressed, the Norman camp remained on alert, its ships drawn up on the beaches, its soldiers training and preparing for the moment when the wind would carry them toward their destiny. while William of Normandy waited on the Channel coast for the right winds to carry his army to England. Events were already unfolding hundreds of miles away that would draw Harold Godwinson's attention far from the south. The threat came not from Normandy, but from the north, led by an exiled English earl and one of the most formidable warrior kings of the age. Tostig Godwinson, once Earl of Northumbria, and now a bitter enemy of his brother Harold, had spent the months since his exile moving restlessly between the courts of Europe. In Flanders, he found shelter with his wife's family, but he sought more than mere refuge. His goal was to regain his earldom and, if possible, to see Harold overthrown. To do this, he needed a powerful ally, someone with the military resources and ambition to challenge the new king of England. That ally emerged in the form of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. Hardrada's name carried weight across the medieval world. As a young man, he had fought in the great battles of Scandinavia, served as a commander in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard, and returned to Norway to seize the throne. Now in his early 50s, he was a veteran of decades of warfare, his reputation as a bold and relentless leader unmatched in the north. Hardrada's claim to the English throne was based on an agreement made years earlier between his predecessor, King Magnus of Norway, and King Harthacnut of England and Denmark. According to this pact, if either king died without an heir, the survivor would inherit his kingdoms. Although the agreement had been bypassed when Harthacnut's death brought Edward the Confessor to the throne, Hardrada considered the claim valid and saw Edward's passing as an opportunity to enforce it. Tostig's arrival in Norway gave Hardrada both a reason and a guide for an invasion. The exiled earl could provide inside knowledge of England's political divisions, the disposition of its noble houses, and the likely points of weakness in its defenses. More importantly, Tostig could promise the possibility of support within England itself, especially among those still loyal to him in the north or hostile to Harold's growing dominance. By late summer of 1066, Hardrada had gathered a fleet estimated by chroniclers to number hundreds of ships. It carried not only Norwegian warriors, but also contingents from his realm's allies and subjects in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, as well as from parts of Scotland. The fleet sailed first to the Scottish coast, where King Malcolm III offered safe harbor and provisions, further cementing ties between Norway and Scotland against their common southern neighbor. From there, the combined forces of Hardrada and Tostig crossed the North Sea and entered the Humber estuary, steering their ships upriver toward the heart of Northumbria. Their first major target was the city of York, the political center of the region, and a prize that would give them a strong foothold in the north. News of the invasion reached Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria quickly. As the principal defenders of the region, they moved to intercept the invaders before York could be taken. The two earls assembled their forces and confronted Hardrada's army near the village of Fulford, just outside York, on the 20th day of September. The Battle of Fulford was a fierce clash fought on marshy ground, where the Norwegians' experience and discipline told. Hardrada's men, tall in their mail shirts and wielding long spears and axes, pressed the English forces hard. Tostig, fighting alongside the Norwegians, knew the terrain from his years as earl and used it to his advantage. By the battle's end, Edwin and Morcar's forces were routed, many of their men killed or captured, and York lay open to the invaders. The victory at Fulford was decisive. The city of York surrendered to Hardrada soon after, agreeing to provide supplies and hostages. The Norwegian king, believing the north to be secured, planned to consolidate his position before advancing further south. He left part of his forces at the ships near Recall and moved with the rest toward Stamford Bridge, expecting to receive the formal submission of the local lords there in the days to come. What neither Hardrada nor Tostig anticipated was the speed of Harold Godwinson's response. The king had been stationed in the south, guarding the coast against a possible Norman landing, but upon hearing of the northern invasion, he acted with extraordinary urgency. He gathered his household troops and as many furred levies as could be summoned on short notice, then marched northward with remarkable speed, covering the distance from London to Yorkshire in less than a week. This march was a feat in itself, a demonstration of the discipline and endurance of Harold's forces. The decision to move so quickly carried risks, leaving the southern coast less protected and exhausting the men before battle. But Harold judged that a rapid strike was the only way to prevent the north from falling permanently into Hardrada's hands. By the time Hardrada and Tostig were awaiting the submission of local leaders at Stamford Bridge, Harold's army was already closing in. The encounter that followed would become one of the most famous battles in English history, not only for its dramatic outcome, but also for the fact that it came just days before another, even greater battle that would determine the fate of the kingdom. The fields east of York were quiet in the early morning of the 25th of September in the year 1066. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and Tostig Godwinson, exiled Earl of Northumbria, waited with a portion of their army near the small crossing at Stamford Bridge. They expected the day to bring formal submissions from local leaders, not the clash of battle. Their ships lay miles away at Rickhall, guarded by a sizable detachment of troops, and many of their warriors, confident after their victory at Fulford, had left their heavier armor at camp. Harold Godwinson, King of England, had other plans. Having learned of the Norwegian victory and the surrender of York, he had pushed his men northward with exceptional speed. Marching from the south coast, they had covered hundreds of miles in less than a week, a feat that demanded both endurance and discipline. His arrival near York caught the invaders entirely by surprise. The English king wasted no time. As his forces approached Stamford Bridge, the element of surprise was still his greatest advantage. The English army, composed of Harold's hardened household troops, the housecarls, and the local furred levies, formed up for battle almost as soon as they were within sight of the Norwegians. Hardrada's men, spread across the fields and lacking full armor, scrambled to form ranks. What followed was one of the most intense and decisive battles of the Viking Age. At first, a single Norwegian warrior, later celebrated in saga as a giant of unusual size and strength, held the narrow bridge alone, wielding his axe to deadly effect. He cut down several English soldiers who tried to cross, delaying Harold's advance long enough for the Norwegians to draw their forces into some semblance of order on the far side. Eventually, English accounts say he was felled from below by a spear thrust through the planks of the bridge, clearing the way for the main assault. Hardrada deployed his troops in a shield wall, a formation that had served Norse warriors for generations. The English advanced, the clash of shields and the cries of battle ringing across the fields. At first, the fighting was even, the Norwegians resisting fiercely despite their disadvantage in armor. But as the day wore on, the sheer weight of the English attack began to tell. Harold's disciplined housecarls pressed forward, striking at gaps in the enemy's line, while the feared closed in from the flanks. In the midst of the fighting, Harold Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow. His death was a severe blow to Norwegian morale, but Tostig took up command and continued the resistance. Harold, perhaps hoping to end the bloodshed, is said to have offered his brother peace and the restoration of his earldom if he would surrender. Tostig refused, choosing to fight on. The battle raged until the Norwegian line finally collapsed. Many tried to flee toward their ships, but the English pursuit was relentless. Those who had remained to guard the fleet at Rickhall attempted to mount a defense, but it was too late to turn the tide. By nightfall, the invasion force was shattered. Out of the hundreds of ships that had brought Hardrada's army, only a small fraction were needed to carry the survivors back across the North Sea. The victory at Stamford Bridge was complete, but it came at a high cost. The English army had suffered heavy losses, and even those who survived were exhausted from the rapid march north and the day's brutal combat. This exhaustion was more than a temporary setback. it would have immediate strategic consequences. For while Harold had been marching and fighting in the north, the winds in the Channel had shifted. William of Normandy, who had been waiting for weeks to launch his own invasion, now had the weather he needed. On the very day Harold's men were burying their dead and tending to their wounds, Norman sails were appearing off the southern coast of England. Harold faced a cruel reality. He had destroyed one enemy, only to find another landing at his back. The cost of the northern campaign was not only measured in blood, but also in time and energy, resources he would desperately need for what was to come. While the fields near Stamford Bridge were still littered with the remains of the Norwegian army, events on England's southern coast took a decisive turn. On the 28th day of September, in the year 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, finally crossed the Channel with the invasion force he had spent months assembling. The winds that had held him in port for weeks had shifted in his favor, and his fleet, hundreds of ships carrying men, horses, and supplies, made the passage to England. The landing took place at Pevensey in Sussex, on a sheltered stretch of shoreline where William could safely bring his troops ashore. The Normans encountered little resistance. Harold Godwinson's forces, still far to the north after the victory at Stamford Bridge, were in no position to contest the landing. This absence of opposition was no accident. William had been carefully watching the situation in England and knew that Harold's northern campaign would leave the south exposed. Once on land, William wasted no time in securing his foothold. He ordered the construction of a prefabricated wooden fort at Pevensey, a modern bailey structure brought in pieces from Normandy and quickly assembled. This would serve as a defensive base and supply point for the army. The Normans then moved east along the coast to Hastings, where they built a second, larger fortification. Hastings, situated on high ground with access to both the sea and inland routes, would become the hub of Norman operations in England. From Hastings, William began a deliberate strategy to provoke Harold into battle. His forces spread into the surrounding countryside, raiding villages, seizing livestock, and destroying crops. This was more than simple looting. It was calculated psychological warfare. By devastating the lands of southern England, especially in the territory of Harold's own earldom of Wessex, William aimed to force the English king into a rapid march south, denying him the time to gather fresh troops or fully recover from the northern campaign. The Norman army that landed at Pevensey was a formidable force, composed of three main elements: infantry armed with spears and shields, archers capable of delivering volleys at range, and heavy cavalry, knights trained to fight from horseback with lance and sword. This combined arms approach was one of William's greatest advantages. The English military system relied heavily on infantry, both professional housecarls and the part-time fyrd, and lacked a significant mounted force capable of matching the Norman cavalry in open battle. William also brought with him a leadership team that included some of his most trusted vassals and relatives. His half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, commanded troops despite his clerical status, and William Fitzosborne, one of the Duke's closest companions, served as a senior military advisor. These men not only contributed to battlefield command, but also helped maintain discipline and morale among the diverse contingents of the army. In the days after landing, the Normans consolidated their position. Supplies were unloaded from the ships, horses exercised and readied for campaign, and scouting parties sent inland to assess the terrain and locate English forces. William could not yet know exactly when Harold would arrive, but he could be certain that the English king would not leave the south in Norman hands for long. For Harold, the news of the landing arrived at a moment of both triumph and exhaustion. He had just secured a decisive victory in the north, but at the cost of heavy casualties and a grueling march. Now, faced with the Norman threat, he had to turn his army around and head south as quickly as possible. This meant another forced march, covering hundreds of miles in just over a week, with little opportunity for the men to rest or for reinforcements to be gathered from distant shires. Harold's decision to move swiftly south rather than wait to rebuild his strength remains one of the most debated choices of the campaign. Some historians see it as an act of necessary urgency. Allowing William more time to entrench himself in Sussex could have been fatal. Others view it as a gamble that denied Harold the chance to bring the full weight of England's military resources to bear. Meanwhile, William continued to apply pressure. The destruction of villages and farmland was not only intended to bait Harold into action, but also to disrupt the English king's ability to supply his forces once they arrived. The psychological impact of seeing one's homeland ravaged by a foreign invader could not be underestimated. William was counting on Harold's sense of duty and honor as both king and earl to compel him into a decisive engagement. By the first week of October, both armies were moving toward the confrontation that would decide the fate of England. Harold was marching south from London, while William was preparing to advance inland from Hastings. The two forces would meet not on the coast itself, but on a ridge of high ground a few miles inland, near the small village that would, in time, lend its name to one of the most famous battles in medieval history. On the morning of the 14th day of October in the year 1066, two armies faced each other on the rolling hills of Sussex. To the south, William, Duke of Normandy, stood at the head of a coalition of Norman, Breton, and Flemish forces. To the north, King Harold Godwinson commanded the English army, still bearing the fatigue of its long marches and recent battles, but determined to defend its homeland against a foreign claimant. The site of the battle was a ridge of high ground near the village of Hastings. Harold's choice of position was deliberate. By taking the ridge, he denied the Normans the advantage of their cavalry's momentum. The slope below would force attacking horsemen to fight uphill against a solid defensive line. His men, professional housecarls at the core and the levied fyrd from surrounding shires, were ordered to form a shield wall, a tactic proven effective against charging infantry and cavalry alike. Shields overlapped, spears projected forward, and the line was anchored on either flank by the terrain itself. William's army was organized in 3 divisions. On his left were the Bretons, known for their light cavalry and archery. In the center, the Normans themselves, with the Duke commanding. On the right, the Flemings, experienced soldiers who had fought in numerous continental campaigns. Each division combined archers, infantry, and cavalry, giving William the flexibility to adapt his tactics during the day. The battle began with an archery barrage from the Norman side. Arrows rained on the English line, but the steep slope and the protection of the shield wall blunted their effect. William then ordered his infantry forward, supported by cavalry. They advanced up the hill, clashing with the English defenders in a grinding contest of strength. The shield wall held, and the attackers were forced back down the slope. At this point, a key episode unfolded that would shape the course of the battle. On the Norman left, the Bretons came under heavy pressure and began to give way. Whether this was a genuine rout or the beginning of a feigned retreat is debated, but English troops on that flank broke formation to pursue the fleeing enemy downhill. This pursuit exposed gaps in the shield wall. Norman cavalry, seizing the opportunity, wheeled around and cut down the pursuers before they could return to the line. William recognized the potential of this tactic and repeated it later in the battle. Each time the English left their strong defensive position to chase the enemy, they found themselves vulnerable to counterattack. These moments chipped away at the cohesion of the shield wall, gradually wearing down Harold's ability to maintain a solid front. Midway through the fighting, a rumor spread among the Normans that William had been killed. In the confusion, the Duke acted decisively. He lifted his helmet to show his face and rode along the line, rallying his troops and demonstrating that he was very much alive. This act of leadership restored Norman morale at a critical moment. The battle continued for hours, with neither side able to claim a clear advantage. The English fought with ferocity, their housecarls wielding long-handled axes, capable of cleaving through shields and armor. The Normans relied on coordinated attacks, archers to harass, infantry to engage, cavalry to break openings, but the uphill struggle was slow and costly. As the day wore on, the English line began to thin. Losses mounted, and the repeated feigned retreats had drawn away enough men to create weaknesses. William ordered a final, concentrated assault. Archers were instructed to shoot high, sending arrows arcing over the front ranks to strike those behind the shields. One of these arrows, according to tradition, struck Harold in the eye, though some accounts suggest he was cut down by Norman knights in the final melee. With Harold dead and his bodyguards overwhelmed, the cohesion of the English army collapsed. Many fled the field, pursued by Norman cavalry. Others made a last stand on the ridge, fighting until they were surrounded and slain. By nightfall, the battle was over. William's forces held the field, and the English leadership had been decapitated in a single day. The victory at Hastings was decisive, but it was not yet the end of William's campaign. While the battle had removed Harold and much of the southern nobility, resistance still existed elsewhere in the kingdom. The path to the crown would require further marches, sieges, and political negotiation. The evening after the Battle of Hastings, William, Duke of Normandy, stood victorious on the field, but his victory was far from complete. Harold Godwinson was dead, along with many of his household guard and leading nobles, yet the Kingdom of England had not simply fallen into Norman hands. England was a land of powerful earls, fortified towns, and established political structures. If William intended to wear the crown, he would have to secure it both by force and through political maneuvering. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, William remained cautious. His army was bloodied from a long day's fighting, and while the English defenders in the south had been broken, the Normans were still deep in hostile territory. The English fyrd system meant that new levies could be raised quickly from the shires, and remnants of Harold's forces might still rally. William's first priority was to ensure his army could rest, regroup, and be supplied before pressing deeper into the realm. From Hastings, William advanced methodically along the south coast, moving first to Romney. This town had, earlier in the year, reportedly attacked Norman sailors who had been blown ashore. William responded by ordering it sacked, a clear signal that resistance would be met with harsh punishment. From Romney, he moved on to Dover, a strategic port that commanded the shortest sea route to Normandy. Dover was strongly fortified, but William's advance was swift and intimidating. The garrison surrendered without significant fighting, though some accounts suggest that fires broke out within the town during the Norman occupation, damaging parts of its defenses. By taking Dover, William secured a direct supply line to his duchy and a fallback position in case the campaign inland went badly. From Dover, the Norman army marched to Canterbury, seat of the archbishop who traditionally crowned English kings. Archbishop Stigand, however, was absent, and Canterbury submitted without battle. William's ability to take these key towns without prolonged sieges demonstrated not only his military threat, but also the uncertainty gripping England's leadership after Hastings. Meanwhile, in London, news of Harold's death threw the city and the royal council, the Witan, into turmoil. Some leading nobles and churchmen favored Edgar Atheling, the young grandson of King Edmund Ironside, as Harold's successor. Edgar had a strong hereditary claim, but at around 14 years of age, he lacked the military experience and following necessary to unite the kingdom in the face of the Norman threat. The earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, whose support could have been decisive for Edgar, hesitated. Their forces had not been present at Hastings, and with William advancing, they may have doubted whether they could muster enough strength to challenge him directly. Instead of confronting William in the south, they withdrew to their own territories, weakening any immediate resistance in the capital. William did not march directly to London after Hastings. Instead, he moved in a wide arc through the southern counties, a deliberate choice that allowed him to devastate areas loyal to Harold, cut off potential reinforcements to the capital, and gather supplies. His troops crossed the Thames at Wallingford, where they received the submission of the influential Anglo-Saxon noble Wygod of Wallingford. This was an important development, as local cooperation eased the Norman advance and gave William a bridgehead for approaching London from the northwest. By late November, William's army was within striking distance of the city. London was defended by its Roman walls and by a population capable of armed resistance, but the morale of its defenders was uncertain. The Norman forces had already demonstrated their capacity for destruction, and the lack of unified leadership among the English magnates undermined any coordinated defense. At Berkhamsted, northwest of London, William received the formal submission of leading nobles and churchmen, including Edgar Atheling, Edwin, Morcar, and Archbishop Eldred of York. This moment was crucial. By submitting, they effectively recognized William as king in exchange for his assurance that he would rule according to the laws and customs of the realm. Whether they acted out of genuine acceptance, fear of further devastation, or simple political calculation, their submission removed the last significant obstacle to William's coronation. William entered London in December. The city, though wary of the Normans, did not resist. The Duke moved quickly to prepare for the formal crowning, understanding that legitimacy, in the eyes of both the English people and the wider Christian world, required a proper coronation ceremony. Westminster Abbey, newly built under King Edward the Confessor and consecrated less than 2 years earlier, provided the perfect setting. On Christmas Day, Archbishop Eldred crowned William King of England. The choice of Eldred, rather than Stigand, was politically astute. Stigand's appointment had long been disputed by the papacy, and his participation could have cast doubt on the coronation's legitimacy. By having Eldred perform the rite, William avoided that controversy and secured the blessing of one of the most senior English churchmen. The coronation ceremony followed established English tradition. William swore an oath to protect the church, to uphold the laws of the realm, and to govern with justice. These promises, though couched in the language of continuity, masked the reality that his rule would bring sweeping changes to England's governance, landholding, and aristocracy. One striking moment during the ceremony, recorded by later chroniclers, occurred when Norman guards outside the abbey heard the shouts of acclamation from within. Misinterpreting the noise as a sign of trouble, they set fire to nearby buildings. The flames spread quickly, sending smoke into the air and causing panic among those gathered. The incident was brought under control, but it underscored the tensions and mistrust that still existed between the Normans and the English population. By the end of the year 1066, William had achieved what he set out to do. He had crossed the Channel, defeated the English king in battle, advanced through southern England, secured the submission of key nobles, and been crowned in London. Yet his hold on the kingdom was far from secure. Many regions, particularly in the north and west, remained only loosely under his control, and resentment toward the Norman presence was already simmering. William's coronation on Christmas Day of the year 1066 gave him the title of King of England, but it did not grant him uncontested authority over the kingdom. The crown he wore was as much a challenge as it was a prize. The conquest had been swift in the south, yet large parts of England, particularly in the north and west, remained only nominally under his control. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had submitted in London, but submission born of expedience was not the same as loyalty. The new king was well aware of this. In the months after his coronation, William returned to Normandy to oversee his duchy, leaving England in the hands of trusted lieutenants, including his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and William Fitzosborne. Their rule was firm but often heavy-handed, and resentment among the English grew. The imposition of Norman garrisons, the construction of new castles, and the redistribution of lands to Norman followers made plain that the old order was being dismantled. The first serious test came in the year 1068 in Exeter. The city, a wealthy and important center in the southwest, refused to recognize the authority of the new regime. Its citizens and local nobles fortified the city walls and prepared to resist. William responded with characteristic decisiveness. Marching west, he laid siege to Exeter for over 2 weeks. The defenders fought stubbornly, but the siege ended when William breached the walls and forced their surrender. His treatment of the city was calculated. He pardoned most of the inhabitants, but ordered the construction of a castle within the walls, a permanent symbol of Norman dominance. The unrest in Exeter was followed by a more dangerous development in the north. In the year 1069, Northumbria, long resistant to southern authority, rose in revolt. The immediate cause was William's appointment of Robert de Comines, a Norman noble, as Earl of Northumbria. Robert's arrival with a force of Norman troops inflamed local resentment, and he was soon attacked and killed in Durham by Northumbrian rebels. This rebellion quickly gained momentum. Edgar Atheling, the young heir of the House of Wessex, who had submitted to William in 1066, now emerged as a figurehead for resistance. Fleeing to Scotland, Edgar secured the support of King Malcolm III, who had recently married Edgar's sister Margaret. At the same time, a fleet from Denmark, commanded by King Sweyn's sons, sailed for England, aiming to revive Danish influence and claim a share of the spoils. The Danish fleet joined the northern rebels, and together they seized the city of York. In the fighting, the Norman garrison was overwhelmed, and both of William's newly built castles in the city were destroyed. This was a serious blow, not only to William's military position, but also to his prestige. The revolt had united northern English leaders, Danish forces, and a claimant with royal blood. William's response was as ruthless as it was swift. Marching north with a large army, he retook York, forcing the Danes to withdraw to their ships. But rather than stopping with the reconquest of the city, he resolved to crush the capacity for resistance in the north once and for all. What followed became known as the harrying of the north. During the winter of 1069 to 1070, Norman forces spread across the countryside of Yorkshire and beyond, systematically destroying crops, livestock, and settlements. Villages were burned, food stores seized or ruined, and the land laid waste. The aim was clear: to deprive the region of the means to support further rebellion. The campaign caused widespread famine. Contemporary chroniclers wrote of corpses lying unburied and of survivors driven to desperate measures to stay alive. The harrying achieved its immediate objective. Organized resistance in the north collapsed, and the region remained subdued for the rest of William's reign. But the cost was immense. The destruction crippled the economy of northern England for years, and the memory of the devastation left deep scars in local consciousness. Even Norman chroniclers admitted the severity of the campaign, and later generations would view it as one of the most brutal episodes of medieval English history. While the north was pacified, other parts of the kingdom also saw rebellion. In 1070, the Isle of Ely in the Fenlands became the center of a resistance movement led by Hereward, later known as the Wake. The marshy terrain made the isle difficult to assault, and it served as a refuge for exiled nobles and rebels from across the kingdom. The Danes, still hovering off the English coast, provided some support, though not in decisive strength. William moved to contain this last major pocket of defiance. Building causeways through the fens, his forces eventually reached the rebel stronghold. After a hard-fought campaign, Ely was taken, and the remaining resistance leaders were captured or driven into exile. Hereward himself disappeared from the record. Whether he escaped, was killed, or surrendered remains uncertain. By the close of 1071, William's position was far stronger than it had been in the years immediately after Hastings. The revolts had been suppressed, foreign intervention repelled, and castles planted in key locations to enforce Norman rule. Yet these victories had come at the price of destruction and bitterness. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely displaced. their lands granted to Norman lords whose loyalty was to the king. The campaigns from Exeter to Ely had transformed England from a conquered realm into a controlled one, but William understood that military conquest alone could not sustain his rule indefinitely. The next phase of his kingship would focus on consolidating that control through changes in landholding, law, and governance, ensuring that the new Norman order would endure beyond his lifetime. The military victories that secured William's throne after the uprisings of the late 1060s were only the beginning of his work. The Norman conquest was not simply a change of monarch, it was the deliberate remaking of England's political and social order. Over the next 2 decades, William transformed the kingdom's ruling class, redistributed its wealth, and altered its very landscape. The most visible and enduring symbol of this transformation was the castle. Before the Norman conquest, England had few true castles in the continental sense. The Anglo-Saxon elite had relied on fortified towns, known as burhs, established in earlier centuries, but these were civic defenses rather than private strongholds. William and his followers brought with them a different military architecture, the Motte and Bailey Castle, a combination of an earthen mound crowned by a wooden or stone keep and an enclosed courtyard surrounded by palisades and ditches. These castles were planted across England with remarkable speed. Some were constructed in the aftermath of battles or sieges, like those at Hastings, Dover, and York, as immediate instruments of control. Others were built deep within the countryside to dominate key routes, river crossings, and agricultural regions. Each served both as a garrison and as the residence of a Norman lord, a constant reminder to the surrounding population that the new regime's reach extended everywhere. The castles were not simply military tools, they were statements of ownership, and the land they defended was being redistributed on an unprecedented scale. William systematically dispossessed the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, seizing their estates and granting them to Norman followers. This process began almost immediately after Hastings, but it accelerated after the major revolts were crushed. By the end of William's reign, only a handful of large English landholders remained, and even they owed their positions to cooperation with the Normans. The king's grants were strategic. He rewarded loyalty and military service, ensuring that those who had crossed the Channel with him or had later proven steadfast in his cause were repaid with substantial holdings. In some cases, entire earldoms passed into Norman hands, while in others, estates were broken up and parceled out to prevent any single magnate from becoming too powerful. William also introduced the concept of the honour, a grouping of estates spread across different shires, tied together under a single lord. This not only made it harder for rebellious lords to gather local support, but also encouraged them to rely on royal authority to maintain their scattered holdings. The structure of land tenure shifted to one in which all land was held ultimately from the king, with tenants-in-chief, his chief vassals, owing him military service, counsel, and payments. The new elite that emerged was a distinctly Norman one, bound together by feudal ties to the crown. Many of these men maintained estates both in England and Normandy, creating a cross-channel aristocracy with interests on both sides of the sea. This dual allegiance would shape English politics for the next century, drawing the kingdom into the complex affairs of northern France. While the redistribution of land created a loyal Norman base, it also deepened the resentment of the English population. Dispossession was often accompanied by the displacement of local administrators, the imposition of foreign sheriffs, and the replacement of established laws and customs with Norman practices. In some areas, the king confirmed existing privileges for towns or monasteries to secure their cooperation, but in many others, the arrival of a Norman lord meant a complete reordering of obligations and rights. The king's own estates formed the largest single block of land in the realm. William expanded the royal domain, the lands held directly by the crown, both through confiscations and by reclaiming lands that earlier kings had granted away. This gave him a secure base of wealth independent of his vassals, and ensured that he could maintain his household, court, and military forces without relying entirely on feudal dues. Norman authority was enforced not only through castles and lords, but also through the reorganization of local governance. Sheriffs, the king's chief representatives in each shire, were now often Normans or other continental allies. They collected taxes, administered royal justice, and ensured that local courts operated in the crown's interest. Their authority was backed by the presence of nearby garrisons, making open defiance a dangerous prospect. In ecclesiastical matters, William pursued a similar policy of replacement and control. Many Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots were removed from office, sometimes on charges of corruption or incompetence, but often simply to make room for Norman clergy. These new appointees were loyal to the king and often connected to the wider reform movement in the church, which emphasized stronger ties to Rome and greater discipline in monastic life. The building of stone churches and cathedrals, often on a scale far greater than before, paralleled the construction of castles. These religious projects served spiritual purposes, but they also reinforced Norman presence in the landscape. Towering Romanesque naves and chancels proclaimed both the piety of the new rulers and their ability to command vast resources. Despite the thoroughness of these changes, William was careful to maintain certain elements of the old order. The shire and hundred courts continued to function, and many aspects of Anglo-Saxon law remained in place. The geld tax, a reliable source of royal revenue, was retained and collected with the same efficiency as before. By preserving these institutions, William ensured administrative continuity even as he altered the structure of power. By the mid-1080s, the transformation of England's elite was almost complete. The nobility was overwhelmingly Norman in origin, its members tied to the crown by bonds of fealty and by the knowledge that their lands came from the king's hand. The network of castles, the spread of Norman legal and administrative practices, and the integration of the church into the new order all combined to solidify William's control. Yet this consolidation did not come without risk. The cross-channel nature of the new aristocracy meant that England's fate was now tied to the politics and wars of Normandy. Moreover, the resentment of the dispossessed and the burden of supporting the new regime's demands would continue to simmer among the English population. William's settlement of the land was a triumph of statecraft, but it laid the foundations for future tensions as much as for stability. By the decade following the conquest, William's hold on the English throne was militarily secure. The revolts had been crushed, castles planted, and the old aristocracy replaced by a Norman elite. But the transformation of England under William was not confined to the battlefield or the distribution of land. He also set about reshaping the kingdom's spiritual leadership and legal framework, ensuring that Norman influence reached into every sphere of governance and daily life. One of William's earliest and most consequential decisions in this realm was the appointment of Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 1073. Lanfranc, an Italian-born scholar and churchman, had risen to prominence as abbot of Saint-Étienne in Caen, one of the great monastic houses of Normandy. He was known for his intellectual rigor, his administrative skill, and his loyalty to William. The appointment marked a deliberate shift. The most senior ecclesiastical position in England was now held by a man of continental background, deeply tied to the reformist ideals spreading through the church in the 11th century. Lanfranc proved to be not merely a religious figure, but a statesman and organizer. Working closely with William, he convened synods, church councils, that restructured the English church along lines more in keeping with continental models. These reforms included the enforcement of clerical celibacy, the reduction of secular interference in church appointments, and the strengthening of ecclesiastical courts. One of the most significant changes was the physical relocation of several episcopal sees. Many Anglo-Saxon bishoprics had been based in rural monasteries, reflecting the patterns of earlier centuries. Under William and Lanfranc, these were moved to larger towns or cities, such as the transfer of the see from Sherborne to Salisbury and from Dorchester to Lincoln. The intent was to place bishops at the heart of urban centers, where they could more effectively oversee their dioceses and exercise influence in both spiritual and civic affairs. Architecture also played a central role in this transformation. Norman bishops and abbots embarked on an ambitious program of church building, replacing many older wooden or modest stone structures with vast Romanesque cathedrals and abbeys. The great rounded arches, massive pillars, and imposing towers of this style proclaimed both the power of God and the authority of the new regime. These building projects were not only acts of devotion, but also visible statements of Norman permanence. William's approach to church governance was marked by a careful balance. While he was a committed supporter of reform and maintained cordial relations with the papacy, he was determined to keep the English Church firmly under royal authority. He insisted that no papal letters or decrees be published in England without his consent, and no bishop or abbot could travel to Rome without royal permission. This ensured that, while the English Church aligned itself more closely with continental practice, it remained loyal first and foremost to the king. The reforms extended beyond the ecclesiastical sphere into the administration of justice. William maintained much of the Anglo-Saxon legal system, which was highly developed by medieval standards, but he introduced changes that strengthened royal control and reflected Norman priorities. One such measure was the formal separation of ecclesiastical and secular courts. In Anglo-Saxon England, many disputes involving clergy or church property had been heard in the same courts as other civil cases. Under the new system, church matters were handled in ecclesiastical courts presided over by bishops or their deputies, applying canon law. This allowed the church to regulate its own affairs more directly, though always under the overarching authority of the crown. William also introduced laws reflecting his own priorities as a ruler and a conqueror. The murdrum fine, for example, was a penalty levied on a community where an unidentified Norman was found murdered. The purpose was twofold: to protect the Norman elite from covert attacks and to encourage local populations to police themselves. If the killer could not be found, the entire hundred or village bore collective responsibility and had to pay a substantial sum to the crown. Another significant change was the expansion of royal forest law. William set aside vast tracts of land as royal hunting preserves, most famously the New Forest in Hampshire. Within these areas, strict regulations governed the hunting of deer and the use of woodland resources. Violations could result in severe punishments, including mutilation. While such laws served the king's leisure, they also symbolized the exclusivity of royal rights and the reach of Norman authority into everyday life. William's legal reforms also reinforced the principle that all land was ultimately held from the king. The feudal oaths of loyalty sworn by tenants-in-chief and in turn by their subtenants were backed by the expectation that disputes over landholding and service could be appealed to royal authority. This hierarchical structure, though rooted in earlier continental practice, became more formalized in England under Norman rule. Despite the changes, William was pragmatic in retaining certain Anglo-Saxon traditions that worked in his favor. The shire and hundred courts continued to function, preserving local mechanisms for resolving disputes and enforcing the king's laws. The geld tax, collected with the efficiency that had impressed even continental observers, remained a cornerstone of royal revenue. By blending the familiar with the new, William ensured that his reforms took root without completely alienating the structures on which English governance depended. By the close of the 1070s, these ecclesiastical and legal reforms had transformed the framework of English society. The church was more closely integrated into a European network of learning, architecture, and governance, yet firmly under the control of the crown. The legal system had been adapted to safeguard Norman power while preserving the administrative machinery that made England one of the best governed realms in medieval Europe. By the decade after the conquest, William's authority within England was largely secure, but the kingdom was no longer an isolated political unit. Through the conquest, England had been drawn into a wider web of continental power centered on the Duchy of Normandy. The king was now both a monarch and a duke, ruling over lands separated by the English Channel, but connected by the loyalty of a new aristocracy whose holdings stretched across both shores. This Anglo-Norman realm was not a static possession. It was a dynamic frontier state engaged in constant negotiation and conflict with its neighbors. One of William's earliest priorities after consolidating his rule was to strengthen the western frontier with Wales. The Welsh kingdoms were politically fragmented, ruled by a shifting mosaic of princes, but they were also fiercely independent and accustomed to raiding across the border into English territory. William did not attempt an immediate conquest of Wales, recognizing the difficulty of campaigning in its mountainous terrain, but he moved quickly to establish a defensive and offensive buffer zone. This was accomplished through the creation of the Marcher Lordships, semi-autonomous territories along the Welsh border granted to some of William's most trusted followers. Lords such as Roger de Montgomery in Shropshire, William Fitzosborne in Herefordshire, and Hugh de Vranches in Cheshire received extensive powers in these regions. They could build castles, wage private war, and govern with wide discretion, provided they defended the frontier and expanded Norman influence into Wales where possible. These Marcher lords combined military pressure with strategic alliances, intervening in Welsh politics to support friendly rulers or destabilize rivals. Over time, Norman strongholds like Chepstow and Shrewsbury became bases for further penetration into Welsh territory. To the north, William faced a different kind of challenge. Scotland, under King Malcolm III, had provided refuge to English exiles, including Edgar Atheling and his family, after the conquest. This gave the Scottish king both a diplomatic bargaining chip and a potential excuse to intervene in English affairs. In the year 1072, William led an army northward in a show of force. The campaign did not result in a pitched battle, but it ended with Malcolm meeting William at Abernethy and swearing allegiance to him as overlord. This agreement was more a political accommodation than a permanent submission, but it established a framework for Anglo-Scottish relations during William's reign. Norman influence in the north was also extended through the strategic placement of loyal magnates in the formerly rebellious earldoms. After the devastation of the harrying of the north, new Norman lords, including Robert de Comines' successors and other trusted followers, took control of key fortresses and lands. Castles were built at strategic sites like Durham and Richmond, serving both as defensive bastions against Scottish incursions and as administrative centers for the surrounding countryside. Across the Channel, William remained deeply involved in the affairs of Normandy. As Duke, he faced constant pressure from neighboring powers, especially the Counts of Anjou and the Dukes of Brittany, as well as from the French crown itself. Although the King of France was William's formal overlord for Normandy, in practice the relationship was marked by rivalry and occasional hostility. William's increasing power after becoming King of England made him a more formidable neighbor, and his French rivals were wary of the resources he could now draw from across the Channel. Maintaining control over both England and Normandy required a delicate balancing act. William spent extended periods in each realm, leaving regents to govern in his absence. In England, figures such as Odo of Bayeux and William de Warenne acted as his deputies, while in Normandy, Queen Matilda and trusted ducal officials oversaw the duchy when William was in England. Communication across the Channel was constant, facilitated by the ports of Normandy and southern England, and the aristocracy itself served as a living link between the two realms, with many barons holding estates in both territories. This cross-channel elite gave the Anglo-Norman realm a unique character. Lords could be summoned to serve in campaigns on either side of the sea, and alliances forged in Normandy could influence events in England, and vice versa. The shared interests of this aristocracy helped knit the two realms together, but it also meant that conflicts in France could draw England into wars that might otherwise have been avoided. William also took steps to assert influence beyond his immediate neighbors. His reign saw Norman adventurers and churchmen participating in the wider movements of the 11th century, including campaigns in southern Italy and Sicily, where other branches of the Norman family were establishing powerful principalities. While these ventures were not directly under William's control, they reinforced the image of the Normans as a dynamic, expansionist people whose reach extended far beyond their original homeland. The king's control of the seas between England and Normandy was a vital strategic advantage. By maintaining secure maritime routes, William could move troops and supplies rapidly between his two domains, respond to threats on either front, and prevent enemy forces from easily crossing into his territories. The integration of England into a larger political and military network made it both more secure from certain threats and more exposed to others. By the 1080s, the Anglo-Norman realm was firmly established as a major power in northwestern Europe. It controlled key trade routes, commanded one of the most formidable militaries in the region, and could project force in multiple directions. Yet this dual monarchy also carried inherent vulnerabilities. The need to defend two separate territories stretched William's resources and attention, and his successors would face the constant challenge of keeping both realms under unified control. By the middle of the 1080s, nearly 2 decades had passed since William's landing at Pevensey. The rebellions that had marked the early years of his reign were long suppressed. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been displaced, and the new Norman order was firmly established across England. Yet the stability William had achieved came at a price. The demands of ruling both England and Normandy required constant attention, and threats from abroad were never far from his mind. It was in this context that the king undertook one of the most ambitious administrative projects of the medieval world, the Domesday Survey. The immediate catalyst for the survey was a combination of military concern and fiscal necessity. In the year 1085, William faced the prospect of an invasion from King Nut IV of Denmark, who had gathered a fleet and forged alliances with discontented nobles in Flanders and possibly within England itself. Although the Danish threat ultimately failed to materialize, the situation highlighted the importance of knowing exactly what resources the crown could draw upon in case of war. At the Christmas court held in Gloucester that year, William ordered an unprecedented inquiry into the wealth and resources of his kingdom. Royal commissioners were dispatched across England, tasked with collecting detailed information about every estate, its holder, the value of the land, the number of tenants, livestock, mills, fisheries, and even how the value had changed since the days of King Edward the Confessor. The survey extended to nearly every shire, with only a few exceptions, such as the northernmost counties beyond the reach of Norman administration after the harrying of the north. The results of this vast undertaking were compiled into what became known as the Domesday Book. The name, recorded by later generations, reflected the perception that its judgments were final and unalterable, like those of the Last Judgment itself. For William, the Domesday Book was a practical tool. It allowed him to assess the exact obligations of his tenants-in-chief, to confirm or challenge their claims to land, and to calculate the revenues owed to the crown. Beyond its immediate fiscal utility, the survey served a deeper political purpose. By recording in detail the redistribution of land since the conquest, it confirmed the legitimacy of the new order. Every Norman lord's holdings were listed and described, linked explicitly to the king as the ultimate source of title. The dispossession of the Anglo-Saxon nobility was thereby codified into the official record, making it not merely a fact of power, but a matter of law and precedent. The Domesday Book also offers modern historians a rare and invaluable snapshot of 11th century England. It reveals a society transformed, a landscape dotted with castles and new towns, a rural economy under the control of a largely foreign elite, and a legal framework that bound every level of society to the authority of the crown. It shows the persistence of older administrative divisions, shires, hundreds, and tithings, alongside the imposition of Norman feudal structures. William did not live long to enjoy the security the Domesday survey symbolized. In the year 1087, while campaigning in northern France, he suffered an injury from which he never recovered. He died in Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and was buried in Caen, in the abbey he had founded there. His death immediately raised the question of succession for his two realms. William had always intended that England and Normandy would not necessarily pass to the same heir. To his eldest son, Robert Curthose, he bequeathed the Duchy of Normandy. To his second son, William Rufus, he granted the crown of England. This division reflected both political necessity and William's recognition that managing the two realms together was a complex and often dangerous task. His youngest son, Henry, received a sum of money but no land, a situation that would change dramatically in the years to come. The reign of William Rufus, beginning in 1087, saw the continuation of many of his father's policies, particularly the maintenance of strong royal authority and the reliance on the cross-channel aristocracy. However, tensions between England and Normandy quickly resurfaced, with Robert and William Rufus at odds and Henry maneuvering for his own advantage. The three brothers' rivalry drew both realms into a cycle of conflict and shifting alliances. In the year 1100, William Rufus died in a hunting accident, an event some later chroniclers suggested was no accident at all, and Henry seized the English crown. Within a few years, Henry I had also taken control of Normandy, reuniting the two realms under a single ruler. Under Henry's reign, the Anglo-Norman kingdom matured into a more stable and administratively sophisticated state, building on the foundations laid by William the Conqueror. The long-term legacy of the Norman conquest was profound. Linguistically, it introduced Norman French as the language of the court, the law, and the aristocracy, while Old English continued as the speech of the common people. Over time, these tongues blended, giving rise to the Middle English of later centuries. Architecturally, the Romanesque style of Norman churches and castles reshaped the built environment of England. In law and governance, the conquest entrenched the principle that all land was held from the king, reinforcing the central authority of the monarchy. The integration of Norman feudal practices with the efficient Anglo-Saxon administrative system created a hybrid model that would influence English government for centuries. The Domesday Book remained a touchstone for legal disputes over land well into the later Middle Ages. Culturally and politically, the conquest tied England's destiny to that of continental Europe. The cross-channel aristocracy meant that England could not be isolated from the conflicts of France, Flanders, and beyond. This connection would lead to both opportunities through trade, marriage alliances, and cultural exchange, and dangers, particularly during the long wars of the later medieval period. By the 12th century, the initial shock of the conquest had faded, but its consequences endured. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was gone, replaced by families whose roots lay in Normandy and other parts of northern France. The church was firmly embedded in the wider Latin Christian world, and the king's authority was more centralized and formalized than it had ever been before. The Norman conquest had begun as a dynastic struggle over succession, but it ended as a transformation of an entire realm. From the windswept beaches of Pevensey to the meticulous entries of the Domesday Book, William's rule had reshaped England's politics, society, and identity in ways that would echo for generations. The Anglo-Norman world he created was both a kingdom and a bridge, linking England to the continent and binding the fate of two shores for centuries to come.